In their introduction to Dialectic of Enlightenment, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer lay out their project. Quote, "In the belief that without strict limitation to the observation of facts and the calculation of probabilities, the cognitive mind would be over-receptive to charlatanism and superstition, this system is preparing arid ground for the greedy acceptance of charlatanism and superstition. Just as prohibition has always ensured the admission of the poisonous product, the blocking of the theoretical imagination has paved the way for political delusion. Even when people have not already succumbed to such delusion, they are deprived by the mechanisms of censorship, both the external ones and those implanted within them, of the means of resisting it. The aporia, the puzzle which faced us in our work, thus proved to be the first matter we had to investigate, the self-destruction of the Enlightenment. We have no doubt, and herein lies our petitio principii, that freedom in society is inseparable from Enlightenment thinking. We believe we have perceived with equal clarity, however, that the very concept of that thinking, no less than the concrete historical forms, the institutions of society with which it is intertwined, already contains the germ of the regression which is taking place everywhere today. If Enlightenment does not assimilate reflection on this regressive moment, it seals its own fate. By leaving consideration of the destructive side of progress to its enemies, thought, in its headlong rush into pragmatism, is forfeiting its sublating character, and therefore its relation to truth, in the mysterious willingness of the technologically educated masses to fall under the spell of any despotism, in its self-destructive affinity to nationalist paranoia, and all this uncomprehended senselessness, the weakness of contemporary theoretical understanding is evident." End quote, and further down they continue, quote, "The enslavement to nature of people today cannot be separated from social progress. The increase in economic productivity which creates the conditions for a more just world also afford the technical apparatus and the social groups controlling it a disproportionate advantage over the rest of the population. The individual is entirely nullified in the face of economic powers. These powers are taking society's domination over nature to unimagined heights. While individuals as such are vanishing before the apparatus they serve, they are provided for by that apparatus, and better than ever before. In the unjust state of society, the powerlessness and pliability of the masses increase with the quantity of goods allocated to them. The materially considerable and socially paltry rise in the standard of living of the lower classes is reflected in the hypocritical propagation of intellect. Intellect's true concern is a negation of reification. It must perish when it is solidified into a cultural asset and handed out for consumption purposes. The flood of precise information and brand new amusements make people smarter and more stupid at once." End quote. Theodor Adorno is known as one of the formative voices of the philosophical movement known as critical theory and was a member of the Frankfurt School. And while Adorno has probably achieved a higher degree of name recognition, Max Horkheimer, his co-author, was certainly no less important as the director of the Frankfurt School. Because of the tarring and feathering of critical theory in general and the Frankfurt School in particular, many on the right and even many centrist liberals tend to avoid these thinkers altogether, relegating their influence to mostly leftist circles. But nevertheless, there is a through line from Nietzsche's thought to the work of Horkheimer and Adorno, and I think it comes through very strongly in this work, Dialectic of Enlightenment, in spite of the fact that you can probably tell from the name of the book, as well as these opening excerpts, that there's a very strong influence from Hegel. As in the quote we just read, they argue that thought is forfeiting its sublative character, that the power of thought is its negative power, that is, literally the power to negate, to reveal the internal contradictions in the concept, bring out those contradictions, and thus open the way to sublating the contradiction. And when we say sublating, I mean that's one of Hegel's favorite terms. This is a translation from Aufhebung, which is not a very direct translation. We don't really have a word for it in English, but sublating means canceling the previous concept. In fact, canceling the whole dialectic, while at the same time preserving that dialectic by lifting it to a higher level of analysis. So, intellect's true concern is the negation of reification. To reify is to make real. Reification in this context refers to the rigidification of conceptual frameworks, right? So the power of the intellect would be to negate those truths that we believe to be solid and unchanging, because these are a reflection of the current moment, the current zeitgeist. And so in so many words, the intellect's real task is to critique, to attack and challenge those thoughts which have become cultural assets. And that is, for better or for worse, the modus operandi of the critical theorists. Many, again, believe they took that principle a bit too far. Nietzsche certainly had his own criticism in his own day for the historical theorists who were stuck in a critical mode. But nevertheless, Nietzsche himself was a critic. That in itself is his criticism. He has a negative or critical period to his own philosophy, as well as an affirmative period. So there's a value in critique. And today, we're going to look at this critique of the Enlightenment itself from two of the foremost critical theorists. Much of the intellectual world, as it stands before us, in the eyes of Horkheimer and Adorno, is simply a world of these cultural assets. Nietzsche might call them idols, and perhaps the central idol, the most important of all idols in modernity, is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment wraps up within it so many of the core values that we reify today: liberalism, democracy, republicanism, the rights and dignity of man, equality under the law, scientific advancement and social progress, and so on and so forth. These concepts have all existed in various latent forms in European society for millennia, but in the Enlightenment they dawn into the zeitgeist and begin to manifest real political consequences. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the expansion of suffrage, bills of rights, abolition of slavery, and so on. We might consider thinkers such as Immanuel Kant, who outlined a vision for perpetual peace and a union of European states, and he explicitly tied this project to the dawning of Enlightenment thought in Europe. And with the Enlightenment, we have a number of movements like that, intellectual and social, which begin to invest a great deal of faith in the inevitability of progress. We might consider the Whigs as one such group. All across Europe, even in monarchical states throughout the 1800s, democratic movements emerged. And furthermore, socialist movements came into being. The most successful strand, of course, were the Marxists, given their impact on the 20th century. Whatever your feelings on Marxism, if we consider the Marxists from the standpoint of the mid-1800s and everything that had transpired in the past couple of centuries, we can see how Marxism fits right in with that zeitgeist, the faith in social progress. Because the Marxists believed that there was a material dialectic, that society itself has this sublative character. That's the materialist turn in Marx, as it's often called, taking Hegel's dialectic and applying it to material reality. To explain this, the short version is this: that Europe begins with very imperfect relations of production, very unequal relations of production, and they're unsatisfying to all parties involved for various reasons, but more unsatisfying to certain parties than others. So first you have these empires with slavery. That type of economic relation is eventually overturned by feudalism. The economic relationship in feudalism is eventually overturned by capitalism. Again, this is a material process that takes place over centuries and millennia, and capitalism does represent, in the Marxist view, a substantial expansion of freedom, rights, even the quality of life. But this relation of production is still imperfect. It still contains a contradiction, just as the bourgeoisie was the contradiction, the central contradiction rested with them in the previous period, right? They became a revolutionary class during the French Revolution. They had overthrown the Ancient regime. Now, the proletariat, the working class wage earners, could also become a revolutionary class. Why? Well, again, this is an oversimplified explanation, but it's largely because the central contradiction of the system is the exploitation of the proletariat, coupled with a reliance on the proletariat. The system exploits them, but the system's dependence on them gives them power. And as this process continues, eventually, the Marxists believed socialism will sublate capitalism, and then communism will sublate socialism, and someday far into the future, maybe even the state will be abolished, and mankind will establish a classless, moneyless, stateless society, one in which there's no exploitation at all, and the rights and freedoms of all are realized. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened. In fact, the 20th century saw the emergence of fascism, Nazism, repressive state socialism from the Soviet Union, the ways that Marxism ended up being interpreted, ended up depriving people of their freedom in many ways. In less than a century, much of Europe would seemingly actively rebel against this inevitable march of progress as the socialists had envisioned it. And in fact, you could say, the fascists were against Enlightenment society as such, even as most liberal Democrats imagined it. Furthermore, rather than the workers developing class consciousness in the most advanced nations on the planet, which is what you would expect if the move toward communism was part of this inevitable process of social progress, instead communist states emerged in places where the people had previously been feudal serfs, like Russia and China. And meanwhile, in the most advanced economies, like the United States, they had cultivated a working class that was, for the most part, conservative. Instead of being radicalized into a revolutionary class, the workers of the West were largely satisfied with the rise in their standard of living brought about by capitalism, and socialism in America largely became a dirty word. And I know we can also debate about the level to which this was brought about by free markets or by social democracy and government spending. The point is, America and the Western world did not proceed down this sublative path closer and closer to communism. If anything, they produced something closer to like a managed democracy, managed capitalism, something like that. In short, after the two world wars, a great puzzle was placed before the intellectuals of the West, particularly those who had vested such a faith in reason and in progress, and above all, the unassailability of those principles of the Enlightenment. Now, for those who embraced Romanticism, or who were critical of the entire Enlightenment project from the start, people like Jonathan Swift or Friedrich Nietzsche, it's easy enough to say, well, that was all a mistake from the very beginning. But this is precisely why Horkheimer and Adorno argue that one who advocates for the Enlightenment cannot cede the ground for criticizing the Enlightenment solely to its enemies. That is, if you do believe, as they do, that freedom in society comes from Enlightenment thinking, and if you value that freedom, then we have to contend with the fact that society as it exists today is still imperfect. There's still exploitation, oppression, profiteering, unnecessary war, subversion of democracy, even forms of slavery. And the dominating ideology seems to be a sort of status quo thinking that either apologizes for these things, makes defenses of them, tries to obfuscate them, or just simply says this is just reality, this is the best we can do. Progress stops here. And given, in some ways, given the increased power of the state today, due to technological advancements and surveillance and advancements in military technology and just all of these things, repression of political dissent is easier than ever. So changing the system by revolutionary force seems to be a fantasy that drifts farther and farther into impossibility every single day. So Adorno and Horkheimer are writing for those for whom there is that puzzle, writing for those who think that we have gained valuable things from the Enlightenment and it shouldn't be so glibly discarded. But at the same time, we then have to understand how it could be that the rationalist society created out of Enlightenment thought could have that attraction towards regression. And so the Enlightenment must be critiqued if we are to understand this puzzle. But it's often misrepresented that critical theory is just about tearing down, deconstructing Western society. As is probably clear from the statements they've made, Horkheimer and Adorno do not have that goal. They're carrying out this criticism with an eye to sublation of the Enlightenment that we discussed a moment ago. They proceed dialectically. Their goal is to reveal the central contradiction in Enlightenment thinking so we can see how it is that the Enlightenment could both liberate and carry through the relations of power and domination that existed before in human society since time immemorial, and even in some ways heighten or sharpen those power relationships. Until we can even begin to address that contradiction, we have to make the contradiction known, understand the nature of that contradiction, how it could be that the essence of enlightenment in both conception and in practice could represent progress and regress at the same time. That is its central contradiction. And this is one of the through lines from the thought of Nietzsche. Nietzsche also questioned whether democracy was possible. Yes, he had values-level criticisms of democracy, but he questioned the viability of these democratic movements and whether or not they were actually going to attain the ideal that they purported. That, one of the passages that he has on anarchism, for example, he questions whether or not anarchism is simply the prelude to the most extreme regression to tyranny. He questioned whether this attempt to make every single person in society into a uniquely valuable individual wasn't part of a leveling process by which everybody was ultimately deprived of their individuality. And Nietzsche, in fact, raises the point many times that by enculturating and breeding mankind to be more subservient, as he puts it, so that in modern times, even the president suggests, I'm only a public servant, right? They use that language of being a servant of the public. Everyone sees themselves as a function. When we do that, we're creating the raw material for a domineering personality to take hold of society. That when an atavistic person, a throwback, someone like Napoleon, who has the charisma and the animal magnetism, the ambition to take command of a state for his own purposes, when that person arises, the average person will be completely prepared to simply obey, because obeying is all that he knows. And writing in the wake of World War II, and specifically addressing themselves to the question of how their country of Germany could have embraced Nazism, that type of prophetic statement by Nietzsche of the power of the autocrat in the world shaped by this leveling egalitarianism, that's very prescient to Adorno and Horkheimer. And that's not to say, by the way, that fascist leaders are the types of leaders that Nietzsche would have approved of. That's not what I'm saying at all. Just notice the underlying dynamic. We make everyone in this democratic egalitarian world into essentially, people all of equal worth or equal value. We're all functionaries of the system. We're all the same in some fundamental way. And then the person who attains power, who feels that he's not the same, who feels that he has the right even to dominate the system, will find them as putty in his hands. That democracy prepares the way for fascism in many ways. So, in some sense, the critical theorists arise in response to this question. Why did the promise of enlightenment ultimately prove insufficient? Why does it seem to undo itself? And you can't answer that question through strictly Marxist dialectical materialism, or at least not very convincingly, because if you have to amend the entire theory because the theory didn't match the facts. Or you can answer it as a reactionary, but in that case, you're just trying to unrealistically turn the clock backward, trying to deny that there was a real drive, a real desire, a real need, a necessity that pushed people into modernity. So what the critical theorists do is they recenter consciousness over materialism. Marxists always had a theory of consciousness. They believed that the material conditions would produce a class consciousness, for example, in the workers. And the critical theorists have to ask, why didn't this happen? And their approach is to say, because it's not always, at least, that the material conditions create consciousness. The consciousness shapes the material and political conditions. The consciousness is important, it's effective, and it does manifest in real terms. That the reification of certain concepts and values does affect what is politically possible. Now, again, this might invite comparison with Nietzsche's thought, and I think Nietzsche would largely agree with some very important caveats. I mean, Nietzsche's analysis of history and politics is material, in that Nietzsche's not an idealist. He calls the consciousness a surface and sign world. It masks a world of unconscious drives. But Nietzsche also gives a great deal of importance to psychology. He does believe psychology is physiologically rooted, so there's something concrete to it, that the ideas that somebody will hold ultimately derive from their relative's health or sickness, their success or failure in life. their position in society, and so on. I mean, the most famous example of this is the master and slave morality. It's very important for Nietzsche that the master and slave morality come out of concrete circumstances. It's not that the master first got the idea, I'm going to go be a domineering master. Rather, he has that idea because of his perception of his own power, right? He realizes, he perceives that his own power is potent, specifically his power to requite. And all sorts of ideas flow from that relative political and social position, which was established by a contest of physical force. But nevertheless, what's the real significance of the master and slave morality? Is it those concrete circumstances from the past that gave rise to these moralities, which no longer exist today? Or rather, is it the fact that those ideas can take hold in the psychology of people today, who no longer live in those same circumstances, who live in very different circumstances? It can still drive their motivations and their values and thus their behavior. And so for Nietzsche, a person of high political power can still be at bottom a slave in their values and in their actions, or somebody who we might expect to express healthy values might be infected by the slave morality and thus become resentful or guilt-ridden, any number of things. And so for Nietzsche, the consciousness proper is only a series of symptoms, but it nevertheless reflects a broader psychological reality, which does refer to those valuations, those reifications, those idols, which exist in the minds of human beings and motivate their actions independently of their current circumstances. Similarly, Horkheimer and Adorno would say the average person in Western liberal, democratic, capitalist society is driven by a series of ideals that they've inherited from the Enlightenment, which was the very movement that promised to liberate mankind through reason. And they may not even realize that they hold these ideals. They may not even know where they come from. The focus of Adorno and Horkheimer is the regressive kernel within those ideas, as they call them, the regressive element inherent to the entire project. What is that project? Liberating man via reason. There is something inherently regressive about that now threatens to undo the whole society and return us to barbarism. So the ultimate conclusion must be that the Enlightenment will undo itself one way or the other. And far from an inevitability as to how this all plays out, it's our decision whether that undoing will come as our downfall and a return to nature in the worst possible way, or whether that undoing will represent the sublation of the Enlightenment, carrying through the spirit of its ideas as regards human freedom and human flourishing and transcending the regressive element inherent in that project. So where does the Enlightenment begin? When does it begin? Adorno and Horkheimer situate it as commencing with Francis Bacon. I know we could have a postmodern argument about the arbitrariness of drawing a neat boundary line as to where the Enlightenment begins, but I don't think it's terribly controversial. I mean, most would say the major figures of the Enlightenment are Descartes and Bacon. And Francis Bacon is, of course, a philosopher of science, a philosopher of law. He and John Locke are the founders of empiricism. Bacon even writes a novella in which there is a utopian society run by scientists. So Bacon is like the perfect encapsulation of the Enlightenment spirit, especially at its beginning, when it's still a possibility, something yet to come. Bacon's New Atlantis is an aspiration. Perhaps society one day could be ruled solely by rational experts. Many in contemporary times are probably highly suspicious of those ideas, but again, consider it from Bacon's perspective and from his time. When all the heads of state are just, they're in power because they're somebody's son. They're not there because of merit or because of how wise or virtuous or rational that they are. And so Bacon stands as a representative of this coming intellectual movement that comes with the Enlightenment, that man has to be governed by reason. And obviously that's a very old idea. I mean, it's a Socratic idea or a Platonic idea. But the reason why it possesses such power for Bacon, and I think why it possesses such power for Europe, is because Europe was on the cusp of the scientific revolution that then is followed up by this industrial revolution. And that is key to how Bacon saw science, by the way. Above all, what he recognizes as the scientist's task, his calling, The scientist's job is to give man the ability to control and dominate nature. From the very beginning of the Enlightenment, therefore, it was stated by its founder, at its core, it's a pursuit of this mastery over nature. Bacon writes, quote, "The sovereignty of man lieth hid in knowledge, wherein many things are reserved, which kings with their treasure cannot buy, nor with their force command. Their spiels and intelligencers can give no news of them. Their seamen and discoverers cannot sail where they grow. Now we govern nature in opinions, but we are thrall unto her in necessity. But if we would be led by her in invention, we should command her in action." End quote. The experimental method, the scientific method, is valuable because it gives us power to command nature. We are in thrall unto her in necessity, so we must learn the laws that nature sets down. But we can be, therefore, led by nature in our inventions in order to command her in action. So we have to play by nature's rules, but once we learn those rules, then we can command nature in terms of our actual activity. So the name for the sovereignty of man over nature is knowledge. That's the picture we're getting here. Empiricism gives us knowledge, but the utility, the value of knowledge is precisely that we can take rulership over nature and become its sovereign. And importantly, knowledge, this form of power, cannot be obtained by force or by purchase. It can only be attained by the man of reason. While the scientific method is based on observation, it requires rationality in order to implement it, right? In order to quantize the world, to put phenomena into measurable and coherent categories, so that what is observed can be put in the form of a mathematical equation that can then be standardized and reproduced. In short, what Bacon perceives at the dawn of the Enlightenment is the power of rationality to conceptualize the world in order to dominate it, to make nature reveal her secrets, and therefore we can become her sovereign. So therefore, the first observation here is that Enlightenment never purely sought truth, if this is true. That was never its purpose. This is a Nietzschean point as well, by the way. Instead, the Enlightenment project, considered from the history of consciousness, is the beginning, really, of a kind of objectification of the world, i.e., scientific rationalism, that seeks to turn nature into objects. Further, the way that this operation is carried out is not based on the standard of correspondence to an absolute truth, right? We get all these theories of truth from philosophers, but was that pursuit of truth really the thing driving this revolution in thought? Horkheimer and Adorno would say no. I mean, science objectifies according to utility. Rationality turns everything into something that can be used. And in fact, I mean, in science, they don't make even technically, in pure positivistic science, they don't even make the pretension to trying to discover the truth as such. And so with the Enlightenment, we begin to approach the world from that standpoint of calculation and utility. Again, things that were always there, but the revolution in thought makes these totalizing in some way. Again, as the promise of liberation. In Bacon's case, liberation from nature. Right? So we're not mastered by nature, but we become master of her. Another way to put this, a very vulgar way, but a way that I think conveys the point, is that knowledge is power. The Enlightenment ultimately sought power. Not just knowledge, or like knowledge for the sake of knowing things. Power through knowledge. And knowledge as power, we could broadly call technology. At least that's the fruit of the Enlightenment approach to the world. That's what it produces, is new technology. That's often how we can objectively speak of the increases in the quality of life and all of these things that the Enlightenment has done for us. We look around and say, look at all the technology we've been able to create. And meanwhile, you could look at, say, the Ottoman Empire as a counterexample of an empire that, I mean, whether or not the Ottoman Empire is part of Europe has always been a contentious issue, certainly at the time of the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment. I don't know if the Ottoman Empire certainly was on the European continent, but I don't think they considered it part of the European civilization. That's neither here nor there. The point is, they have a religious social movement that basically calls into question whether or not change and philosophy, art, technology, all of these things, are they always good things, or should we be more skeptical of them? And they lean towards becoming more skeptical of change and progress. And again, vastly oversimplifying the case, but the Ottoman Empire stagnates because they adopt an ideology of religious conservatism and skepticism toward technology and change, whereas European civilization in the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, throws themselves wholly into change and technological and scientific progress. But Horkheimer and Adorno are very keen to reject the notion that social change is driven by technology itself, or that, technological progress and the changes that it brings in and of themselves are responsible for social conditions. That would be a more Marxist materialist view. I know not all Marxists hold that view, but, it would be looking to some sort of material basis that sort of has nothing to do with consciousness as an explanation, right? That the changes in technology in themselves drive the changes in consciousness. The technology shifts the relations of production and consciousness follows, something like that. Horkheimer and Adorno, on the other hand, insist that we cannot just view technology as an active force on society separate from those who possess it, as if there's no wielder, right? So, like viewing the sword separate from the hand who wields it is rather absurd. In other words, the technology itself cannot be blamed for setting the social conditions, because the technology is in the hands of people who make decisions of how to use it and what technology would be best to develop. And our desires and our motivations, our ideals, right? The ideals of the Enlightenment that we all hold, the ways that we wish to master nature and for what ends, these determine how we allocate resources to develop technology, what scientific questions we want to explore and invest grant money into, and how that technology will be used in the market and by the state, and so on and so forth. But again, Horkheimer and Adorno don't see that as just a simply inevitable consequence of current technology. It's a consequence of the consciousness of those with capital, with the power, the grease of the wheels of modern society, as capital. So, quote, "It is no longer the objective laws of the market which govern the actions of industrialists and drive humanity toward catastrophe. Rather, the conscious decisions of the company chairman execute capitalism's old law of value, and thus its fate, as resultants no less compulsive than the blindest price mechanisms. The rulers themselves do not believe in objective necessity, even if they sometimes call their actions by that name." End quote. So the people who are wielding the technology are enforcing a certain set of ideas, a certain status quo. And it is a decision. And Horkheimer and Adorno allege they don't even believe that it's actually an objective necessity, that their so-called logic of the market is something that's simply binding on them, that they have to abide by. So technology is developed and it's applied for the sake of the ruling power and the ideas of the status quo. It also shapes the ruling power, it should be said. It's not a one-sided dialectic. Such a thing wouldn't even be a dialectic. Technology is, relatively speaking, compared with dynastic power, democratic, which might be a strange thing to say, but it's in the same way that capitalism is relatively democratic compared with feudalism, right? You could say capitalism's hierarchical and capitalism is exploitative, but it's open to anyone regardless of birth or station to succeed in capitalism. Now, realistically, does everyone have an equal opportunity to succeed? No, but it's not as if, like in the old days of feudalism, you could become as successful as you like, but you'll never have an old name, a title of nobility and blood, and a right to a certain status and dignity in society. That, at the very least, that aspect of capitalism, its meritocracy, as we say in modern times, is more relatively democratic, quote unquote, than the situation under feudalism. And so too with technology. Anyone who applies themselves, who learns the math and the science, right? Now, is there an equal opportunity to learn all that? Are the ability to learn and, all of these things equally distributed? No. But again, just as capitalism is relatively democratic compared to feudalism, within the realm of science and technology, anyone who has the math, who has the knowledge, can seize that power over nature. That's really the key here, that nobody owns the math, nobody owns the knowledge. I guess I know people do try to like patent knowledge and stuff like that, but which is very absurd. But and I wonder what Horkheimer and Adorno would have to say about that. But nevertheless, I mean, you can't actually patent knowledge. You can't stop other people from knowing things that if they happen to know them, right? Anyway, that's all. I don't want to get into too big of a digression, but Horkheimer and Adorno address this. They write, quote, "Knowledge, which is power, knows no limits, either in its enslavement of creation or in its deference to worldly masters, just as it serves all the purposes of bourgeois economy, both in factories and on the battlefield. It is at the disposal of entrepreneurs, regardless of their origins. Kings control technology no more directly than do merchants. It is as democratic as the economic system with which it evolved. Technology is the essence of knowledge. It aims to produce neither concepts nor images, nor the joy of understanding, but method, exploitation of the labor of others, capital. What human beings seek to learn from nature is how to use it to dominate wholly both it and human beings. Nothing else counts." End quote. So the key point is that technology is constantly seized upon by those positioned to utilize it. This happens not as a blind process of fate or as an inevitability, nor is there something special or uniquely evil about those who possess its power. Once again, contained within the premises of Enlightenment rationality is the domination of nature and all things within nature, including human beings, and eventually including even thought itself. Again, does that remind you of any of Nietzsche's observations? I mean, granted, Nietzsche hardly ever talks about capital as a domineering force, but the claim being made is that beneath the high-flying idealism of the Enlightenment, its universalism, its movements of egalitarianism or secular humanism, what really allowed for this revolution in thought was the power that it afforded to those who embraced that revolution. Those European countries that most rapidly industrialized were among those who would go on to largely take over the world in the coming centuries. And we can see how contained in this development, in that meritocratic essence of technology, the dynastic value system is immediately disrupted and destroyed because dynastic power is ultimately irrational. So whatever our ideals about the drive for knowledge, that's what's really driving the process, that the structure of rationality itself is thus to turn the world into useful quantities, to create unities, and here we mean conceptual unities, not for the sake of truth in the revelatory sense, but truth in the pragmatic sense. Quote, "For enlightenment, anything which does not conform to the standard of calculability and utility must be viewed with suspicion." End quote. To return to a question that we raised earlier about the abandonment of many of the Enlightenment's ideals and the return to what Horkheimer and Adorno call barbarism, here mostly referring to fascism or National Socialism, here we begin to sketch out one possible answer, that Enlightenment, as a totalizing rationalism, will eventually turn against its own myths. And here we mean its own image of life and its own narrative about the meaning of life that sort of came at the beginning of the Enlightenment. It's another central contradiction that most of us would recognize, that we routinely set Enlightenment against myth as mutually exclusive, right? Enlightenment was that which banished myth and superstition. And we therefore see the return of myth and superstition as the rejection of Enlightenment and a regression to earlier modes of thinking and valuing. But one of the through lines of Dialectic of Enlightenment is the notion that myth and Enlightenment are one and the same, that they're two sides of the same coin, that even in the earliest myths of mankind, we already have a form of enlightenment. What does that mean? Well, because the personification of nature into the form of gods and spirits, and the stories of these personified natural forces, were a provisional explanation of the world, an attempt to name the things of the world, put them into conceptual categories. And therefore that represents in a way a sort of demystification of the world. That also the rituals and sacrifices are a way of attempting to bargain with the world, which, however effective or ineffective you may think that is, that's an attempt to take control of nature or to negotiate with nature, to have some foreknowledge of what's going to happen or some assurances of what's going to happen in nature. And prior to myth and ritual, if such a state of being ever existed, mankind, I mean, what would that be? A pre-mythic age? I mean, that would be mankind as animals or just in a state of what? Utter confusion about nature? The attachment of names and stories to the world, to the external world, the creation of theodicies and rituals and sacrificial traditions and these things, that represented the attempt to theorize, to make wild nature into a conceptually explored territory. Quote, the Olympian deities are no longer directly identical with the elements but signify them. In Homer, Zeus controls the daytime sky. Apollo guides the sun. Helios and Eros are already passing over into allegory. The gods detach themselves from substance to become their quintessence. End quote. So even in myth, what we have is a signifier, a name that creates a separation between the thing itself, or we might say nature itself, and the human name for it, by which the mind attempts to take possession of nature. But by the time we get to, say, Homer's epics, the sun god is no longer literally the sun even, right? He's a deity that controls the sun, which means recognizing on some level the unconsciousness of actual nature and seeing nature instead as perhaps guided by a rational principle, albeit, governed by a deity, a personified deity still. But still, that's, there's something going on in the mind as it's making these conceptual separations and significations. And so, once again, that's not just because the ancients wanted to understand nature for the sake of knowing the truth. The myths of ancient Greece not only related tales about the mastery of nature, but they also give accounts of gods instructing man to become the masters of nature, just as gods themselves are. And that's no less true of Old Testament values. Yahweh gives Adam and Eve dominion over all the animals, over all the earth. God makes man in his image, right? And God is the ruler of the universe, and then commands man to take possession of the earth. And so the ancient Greeks, too, they saw that themselves in the image of Zeus, right? They honor Zeus as ruling the heavens, but men are called to, for example, administer justice over all the cities, just as Zeus administers justice over the heavens, and it's Zeus himself who declares that all shall have a share of justice. Quote, in their mastery of nature, the creative God and the ordering mind are alike. Man's likeness to God consists in sovereignty over existence, in the lordly gaze, in the command. Myth becomes enlightenment, and nature mere objectivity. End quote. So this is the thing. This is the really interesting and subtle point that they're making. That contained within both myths and scientific rationalism, they both reflect this desire in mankind there since time immemorial to master nature. And specifically the claim mankind, either because he's made in the image of God or because he's the rational animal, whatever it might be, we possess this faculty that's been given to us or that we've attained that allows us to take dominion over the earth. That's been there since our earliest myths and stories. And as we know from the words of Bacon, that was there at the beginning of the scientific revolution in thought. So Horkheimer and Adorno identify a number of things, and this is where the argument gets a little sketchier in my view, but I'll still think it's worth going through because there might be something to them or something that might fire off in your brain from hearing this. But they identify a number of things, like scientific tendencies in thought as they later manifest in the Enlightenment, that were already present in myth. So, for example, atonement. Everything that happens must answer for why it has happened. We might also say that that's the tendency behind writing the cosmogonies and the theogonies was to explain why it is that everything that exists in the world came into being. The story of Demeter and Persephone. Why does that? Why do we have this changing of the seasons, so on and so forth? The changing of the seasons in that myth answer for why they have to happen. Repetition is another element. So literal repetition of the myths as stories, for example, in the oral tradition. The dramatization and the rituals, the ways of drumming the myth into the mind, which were thought to have a designated effect on the mind. They also point out identification. So again, the myth becomes, in another way, a signifier with which ordinary happenings and figures can be identified. So the myth gives you a sort of, we might say, One way to look at this is a myth could give you a series of types, and you might begin to see those types. The myth perhaps as the archetype, and then you can see those types in ordinary people, and it helps you sort of make sense of ordinary day-to-day happenings according to the blueprint of that myth. And each one of these things contains like the seed of a later scientific tendency and thought. So atonement, they tie to the doctrine of action and reaction, or cause and effect. So every cause must have every effect must have a cause. It must answer for why it has happened, right? Repetition, right? Obviously, repeatability is one of the main scientific values. Identification, right? The signifier that conforms disordered nature to the variable, to the X. So myth, the argument then is like, there's all these things about myth that are already preparing the mind to grasp nature not merely as a subjective phenomenon, and to begin to regard nature objectively. And the myth does this both in content and in its practical manifestations. And there's this notion of the mind reaching out and taking possession as part of a prelude of, or maybe even part of the same activity of, the process of physically or materially taking possession. And that's also what eventually technology does for us. It allows us to reach out and take possession, to utilize nature as we will. And the other side of this coin is that enlightenment itself contains myth, or is also myth. So myth is enlightenment, enlightenment is myth. And what are those myths of the Enlightenment? How is it that the Enlightenment contains myth? Well, the belief in reason's liberatory power, for one, is largely an article of faith. Or the equality of all mankind, which is, you could almost call that a superstition in terms of, if you want to talk about equality of rights, that's one thing. But in terms of all men being created equal in the sense that is in the Declaration of Independence, again, there's a reason why they cite God as a origin for that idea, because you can argue that that descends from the idea that all men are equal in the eyes of God. But it's not obvious that people are equal in any sort of physical or fundamental sense. And so that dovetails then, if the real important thing is their rights, we could also question the whole ideas of human rights and human dignity, or the ideas of popular sovereignty or due process. Ultimately, it's very easy to argue for any of these positions from like the perspective of self-interest, right? Just saying, look, when we have all of these concepts or these ideas, regardless of their absolute truth, it produces a better outcome for society to hold those views. But just notice what's being argued there. You aren't actually making the argument in that case that there is like an inherent value to human beings, or that rights are some sort of actual moral, realist, eternal fact. You're arguing based on utility, based on generating the best outcome. What kind of world do we want to live in? It's very hard to make an argument for all of these things as an objective fact. I'm not saying it's impossible or that people haven't tried, but I would say that most people who do make the argument for these things would make it on the basis of utility, which says something in and of itself, that we're acknowledging that it's a myth, but we need to hold on to that myth for fear of the consequences otherwise. People make these kinds of arguments all the time, by the way. I've pointed out how both Christopher Hitchens and Jordan Peterson, two very different figures, made very glib and flippant arguments about free will that mostly boiled down to the idea that we have no choice other than to hold on to the free will idea, even though it's impossible to prove it, because the consequences would be too bad if people stop believing in free will. The point that Horkheimer and Adorno are kind of raising here is like, you've already demystified the myth when you make that argument. You've already capitulated to the standpoint of rational utility and calculability, right? That's the way, that argument in and of itself, of arguing for human rights on the basis of utilitarian standpoint, is already the destruction of myth, of the myths of the Enlightenment by the Enlightenment. It's your enlightened rationality telling you, I can only argue for this as a sort of, from a consequentialist rational framework. Not that it's actually an objective inherent fact that human beings have value and dignity. because you almost have to rely on some sort of supernatural claim to make that kind of statement. And so, and we must notice, by the way, that on the other hand, there are people who have, in the modern secular mechanized view of the world, concluded that human beings do not have inherent value, and even openly embraced that fact. And so if one regards man strictly as a species of animals among other animals, we have to ask, in a scientific worldview, purely scientific, why would we expect to find an objective basis for human rights and freedoms, especially when we don't afford such value, such rights and freedoms, to other animals, right? So how could we apply that to human beings in a rational sense? So part of the danger of the Enlightenment, this conceptual movement in which rationality becomes totalizing, quantizing everything into useful objects, technology, here meaning knowledge is power, as we've defined it, is harnessed in the direction of creating utility, creating efficiency, and so on. And that produces this mode of thinking that will eventually desacralize the world. It will wipe out the myths of Apollo and even eventually Jesus Christ. But it will also wipe out the myths of human rights, for example. Human rights will appear in this new mode of thinking to be just as empty a concept as man's having been made in the image of God. So Horkheimer and Adorno write, quote, "Bourgeois society is ruled by equivalence. It makes dissimilar things comparable by reducing them to abstract quantities. For the Enlightenment, anything which cannot be resolved into numbers and ultimately into one is illusion. Modern positivism consigns it to poetry. Unity remains the watchword from Parmenides to Russell. All gods and qualities must be destroyed." End quote. And that's one helpful way of looking at the situation, the destruction of qualities at the hands of quantities, of quantized thought. But that's what has to happen. That's what always happens. It happened before in myth. Myth, in fact, is part of that same dialectical struggle that culminates in enlightenment. They're the same thing at different levels of development, we might say. The Enlightenment is another myth. It is its own myth that negates itself. The divine is eliminated, qualities become quantities, the individual becomes a type or a category. Everything is objectified according to use. All the ideals of the Enlightenment that premised this project are steadily negated as this dominating rationality fulfills all of its necessary consequences. I think if anyone is perplexed at this point, it's very useful to be familiar with at least the basics of Hegelian dialectic to understand the point that Horkheimer and Adorno are driving at, because dialectic is not easy to grasp. As I've tried to explain it in the past, it's based on a type of reasoning that doesn't really follow the law of non-contradiction, that A can't equal not A. Rather, dialectic follows the logical law of contradiction, that A must equal not A, that every concept contains its own contradiction. That contradiction is inherent in the process of reasoning. So one example of such a contradiction that is revealed by dialectically thinking about Enlightenment rationality would be that rationality as power is the way that we establish ourselves as master. That's what the Enlightenment brings. The way that we do this is by rationally objectifying the world. That's the mode of understanding of reality that allows us to take power over the world. That in itself creates the subject-object split, the division of the world into ordered logos, like the mind, the word concept, reason itself, and the disordered mass of nature. And so we thus estrange ourselves from nature by conceptually taking possession of it, which is counterintuitive because you would think we would be bringing it closer. We now have a map of nature in our mind. Doesn't that bring nature closer to it? But by making nature a reflection of our own subjectivity, really, paradoxically, we separate it from ourselves. To put this another way, the tables of categories for organizing the natural world serves the function of making us feel distinct from the world that we have categorized. That very understanding makes us feel as though we are a neutral observer, sort of taking in the world, but separate from it. And so on the grand scale, so that's one of the contradictions, right? That might be unexpected. It's a contradiction in the concept of, what might we say, objectifying nature. That the contradiction is that it actually makes it part of your subjectivity while simultaneously making you subjectively feel separate from it, right? So it doesn't actually make it objective, it makes it subjective, and at the same time, the refutation of your subjectivity, or not the refutation, just fundamentally not experienced as a part of your subjectivity. But on the grand scale, right, so that's one contradiction. The greatest contradiction is that myth is this unfolding drive in human history, the rational drive, its true character. Myth is just its inchoate form. It will eventually negate itself. Enlightenment always is this element in myth that turns against it and attempts to dissolve it and disenchant the world. Because the more the world is disenchanted and turned into something ordered and structured and calculable, the better it can be used, and eventually that philosophy of pragmatism, utilitarianism, whatever we want to call it, is too rational to be ignored. And so the Enlightenment, the people who make the case for the Enlightenment today tend to sell it according to the myths, but oftentimes they themselves are critics of the actual reality that the Enlightenment has resulted in. But they can't actually comprehend why that's happening, because they constantly just refer back to we need to go back to the ideals of the Enlightenment. And they're constantly up against this wall that those are myths that people can't believe in anymore, precisely because of the Enlightenment thinking that creates corrosive rationality, as they call it, right? It's corrosive because it corrodes, it eats away at everything else around it. That the scientific Enlightenment is sold as the path to the realization of a certain myth, and what happens instead is that as a myth, it negates itself, and the only thing left is the corrosive rationality. And so in our society today, only the relations of technological domination as they happen to be established are really left behind. It's become a totalitarian, authoritarian, collectivist mindset of domination. Where do we see this mindset in the culture? I mean, in the initial essay, Horkheimer and Adorno point in a few directions. It's like a symptomology of all of what we've been talking about, of the desacralization of the world. So these are all very modern products, but relativism, the linguistic turn in philosophy, analytical philosophy itself, the quantizing of the entire discipline into formulaic form, positivism itself as an ideology. These are all positions that we would have to conclude are only possible at the end of the Enlightenment project, by the way. It's not just that these ideas are they're not anti-Enlightenment in an incidental way. It's not that these ideas come out of the Enlightenment but turn about and critique it. It's that they're not even conceivable without the Enlightenment, right? So the linguistic turn. So Wittgenstein's claim that all philosophical disagreements are just linguistic misunderstandings, right? That's the kind of rational proposition you could only put forward at this point in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, at Wittgenstein's point. Or B.F. Skinner's idea that human beings are just machines that need certain inputs to be happy, right? It's such a thoroughgoing mechanistic view of life to where it becomes totalizing. But it's that comes after centuries of mechanistic thought, right? Or the American pragmatists who think the truth should just conform to what's practical, right? All of this, notice, all of these are types of outlooks are somewhat hostile to absolute truth claims, really, while at the same time representing the culmination of the truth-seeking project of Enlightenment philosophy, because again, all of these thought movements are kind of inseparable from the end of the Enlightenment, the end that the Enlightenment has produced. So what happens when the truth claim itself becomes a mere concept? Truth itself is just a linguistic expression, right? A signifier and a signifier only. Philosophy, what happens to philosophy in that case? Well, it turns its focus entirely to the calculable, to a purely mathematized science, as analytic philosophers have tried to do. Or other philosophers begin to say all philosophies are just expressions of a power relation, or perhaps the author's confession, or something like that. So Adorno and Horkheimer write, quote, mythology itself set in motion the endless process of enlightenment by which, with ineluctable necessity, every definite theoretical view is subjected to the annihilating criticism that it is only a belief, until even the concepts of mind, truth, and indeed enlightenment itself have been reduced to animistic magic, end quote. So the radical claim being made here, and this is why I love this book, is that it's not a romantic reaction against the Enlightenment that now threatens us, like threatens, reasonable scientific views of the world or something like that. It's not those with openly, outdated or atavistic modes of thought that are the real threat to the Enlightenment's liberation of the individual. Rather, the threat to individuality is itself a consequence of the leveling of individuality that must come with this corrosive rationality at the center of the Enlightenment, which will ultimately corrode all its other aspects. The reduction of everything and everyone to a quantity. That's what makes mankind into a herd animal, in the modern sense of the herd, right? Obviously, there have been groups and tribes throughout time, but Horkheimer and Adorno would see the kind of herd animal that mankind is becoming now as a very modern phenomenon, as something that the Enlightenment itself created. Quote, under the leveling rule of abstraction, which makes everything in nature repeatable, and of industry, for which abstraction prepared the way, the liberated finally themselves become the herd, troop, which Hegel identified as the outcome of enlightenment, end quote. And so Horkheimer and Adorno then address themselves to that central riddle. Why the fascist regression? And their conclusion is that the Hitler Youth is not a relapse into the old barbarism. Rather, it's a triumph of what they would call, quote, repressive egalite, end quote. And that's not normally it's not normally a combination of words you hear in leftist thought, but egalite, given here in French, because that was, of course, the French revolutionary cry for equality. And, throughout history, reactionaries like de Maistre and Nietzsche would say, in spite of how much the classical liberals, who see themselves as the Enlightenment's advocates, will criticize the French Revolution, this revolutionary cry was demanded by the values of the Enlightenment, as is the French Revolution itself, right? There's so much apoplectic rage over the French Revolution among mainstream conservatives these days, but every mainstream conservative today would have been standing on the left wing as advocates of Republican government against monarchy. So, and the thing is, Horkheimer and Adorno would agree in description with reactionaries like Nietzsche and de Maistre, as would probably Marx to some extent, right? But Horkheimer and Adorno agree. The result of the Enlightenment ethos is an oppressive form of collectivism. That's what becomes necessitated by egalite. That's how egalite sublates itself. It begins as this notion of equal rights for all, but corrosive rationality gets rid of the myth of rights, except as a functional, pragmatic series of rules for, helping smooth along due process and ensure order. It's not something absolute or God-given, it's just a pragmatic reality, right? Which means that it might be pragmatic sometime to suspend human rights and not honor human dignity, right? That's sort of the problem with the pragmatic argument for it. But if we get rid of the rights part and equal rights, and that's saying all that remains is equality, right? Because rights are part of the Enlightenment myth. So all that's left is equalization of everyone and the quantization of everyone. Everyone becomes conceived as a quantity or a type. Equalize all the populace together. Make every individual a repetition of an abstraction. And we do this all the time in average, just everyday language, right? The average American is such an abstraction. What are some others? The working people, the likely Democratic voter, the young urban professional. It just goes on and on. It's a statistical view of mankind, and it's often reflects this view of man as Homo economicus. And furthermore, we've called into question that whole idea of a self with this negation of myths, right? How can we even say there are individual selves? We've eliminated individuals as a cause in history and have primarily put forward the idea that it's forces or historical factors, whatever those mean. These are more abstractions, right? We've eliminated free will, as we've talked about. We see only impulses and social factors and social drives and causes and effects. And so we can see how the totalizing rational impulse makes the individual a statistic, and in some strange way, that's the final outcome of that cry for equality way back in the 1700s. So everything has to be given a signifier. Everything has to be subjected to mathematization. The result is positivism. That's the culmination and the negation of enlightenment. And man in the present day finds himself well-fed, well-cared for, but alienated from himself and from the rest of nature. And that's related to the subject-object split we mentioned earlier. By the way, part of the human condition, which is inseparable from our modes of rational thinking. And we find its origin in the appropriative movement of thought. It's by taking possession that man becomes alienated, right? But man is required to continue taking possession because, quote, humans believe themselves free of fear when there is no longer anything unknown. This has determined the past of demythologization, of enlightenment, which equates the living with the non-living, as myth had equated the non-living with the living. Enlightenment is mythical fear radicalized. The pure immanence of positivism, its ultimate product, is nothing other than a form of universal taboo. Nothing is allowed to remain outside, since the mere idea of outside is the real source of fear, end quote. And so we're constantly driven to continue to not let anything remain outside the realm of the mind's domination, right? We don't want to have any unknowns, any scary. That's like the primary source of human fear, is the unknown. And so we're simply, we're sort of, it seems almost impossible to say how we could stop this appropriative movement of thought. And so the logic of enlightenment therefore says that these conceptual signifiers have to encompass the whole world. Language, mathematics, everything has to be given a name or a designation, become a factor, or it must be in some way taken account of. But what is language and what is mathematics? I mean, we know that these are simply systems of signs and signifiers, we touched on this before. So Horkheimer and Adorno write, quote, as sign, language must resign itself to being calculation, and to know nature must renounce the claim to resemble it. As image, it must resign itself to being a likeness, and to be entirely nature must renounce the claim to know it, end quote. So, to put this in straightforward terms, we don't mistake the equation for actually resembling nature. It's understood as a signifier, as a means of taking possession, but it's not the thing itself. Obviously, nobody would make that mistake. But meanwhile, when we make an image, art or poetry, something in the likeness of nature, but without being encapsulated in the calculability of enlightenment, we treat it as untrue. And Horkheimer and Adorno, they go on to bring up the anti-artistic bent of Plato, sort of bringing out how that's always been there within the theoretical. Remember Nietzsche's assertion that the whole modern world is in the grip of a kind of Socratic rationalism, the theoretical approach to life. So the truth itself becomes calculability and utility and power, and meanwhile the sincere or authentic portrayal of nature found in art that might seem to be intuitively or on a sentimental level a representation of the truth, that becomes seen as falsehood or illusion or something like that. And so art becomes a little closed-off sphere, one of the last places safe from this rationalist taboo, a magical space where special laws prevail. And, we might say science purports to mirror the mundane world, and art has become the domain of the super mundane. And so our images and our representations of reality that actually bear a likeness to it, the artwork depicting wild nature or something like that, the positivist might say that's unreal. I mean, sure, it depicts the real, but that's just art. It's just something seen from an artist's perspective. That's not as real as the biological understanding of that species of, tree that can be encompassed in a formulae or something. The painting of the tree is not as real as the mathematized equation that describes it or something like that, even though we know that that's only a sign and a language for comprehending it. Again, I should make it clear, I don't fully buy all of these arguments of some of the generalities or the ways that they put forward sort of like the perspectives on art here. But I think there are at least some people who think like this in the modern age. That, and we will get to, I think, far, far more substantive claims about the position of art and its, relation to culture in a moment. But in any case, they do, to their credit, Horkheimer and Adorno mention that sometimes there have been philosophers who have ranked art higher than intellectual knowledge. So they mention Schelling. We might also think of Nietzsche or Goethe. But the bourgeois world, they argue, was ultimately not persuaded by these perspectives. They argue that this perspective just doesn't really jibe with the Enlightenment dialectic as we've considered it. It just wasn't persuasive to the cultural consciousness. That art needs to be made calculable and useful too, or else it will remain relegated to secondary importance. And so to the extent that art exists and thrives in this economy, it is commodified, it's made useful, it's made profitable. Art is widely consumed now, more widely consumed by the general public than ever before. But it's consumed in forms which are primarily designed to give entertainment. And we might say this is useful as its own industry. It's also useful for providing sort of recreation to the workers so that they can continue to be productive and keep working. It's a very absorbing entertainment through mass culture is a very sort of capitalist-approved form of recreation, right? So art has become a commodity. And because it's a commodity, those market forces have pushed it to become largely mere entertainment. That's what we live in a time where there's like more art disseminated to the world than ever, but most of it is just merely entertainment. It barely deserves to be called art at all, if even it does. And above all, that's the main place, the artistic world. So that it's a real problem that this has happened to the artistic world, because that's where we've placed subjectivity and passion and drive and motivation, right, in the realm of art, which is ultimately we call a realm of falsehood, or we understand it as a realm of the unreal. But that's where you're supposed to express all your passions and all of your, your motives and your drive and your desire and your hopes and dreams and fears, and everything irrational is supposed to go there. It's supposed to be put in that box. And spiritual too, right? Because the irrational includes the spiritual and the mythic and so on and so forth. We've banished it all to that closed off sphere. Because Horkheimer and Adorno argue there's a good reason for this. Where we perceive power is just not in passion. It's in neutrality, right? In this new world, in the impartiality of science. And we might say in the calm demeanor of the type of the scientist, right? In calmness. That's how authority is manifest in the modern world. Science, or at least the scientific rationalist way of viewing the world, that becomes a conservative mode of looking at the world. And in that sense, right, it becomes bound by the pre-established concepts and signs, which it isn't invested in emotionally so much as it has a rational certainty in them. It has rational certainty, or that person of this mindset has the rational certainty, I know what reality really is. And we can see how the scientific neutral way of speaking is manifest in every domain of authority in modern life. I mean, we can see this in the way a list of charges are read or a patient is diagnosed. It's presented as the objective fact of their guilt or their insanity. So again, all of this very much resembles the theoretical type of society that Nietzsche criticized in Birth of Tragedy. The society established and run as a system. Society, when it's understood in this manner, or when people who run society understand their task in this manner, you could put it this way: it's almost a politics that seeks to transcend politics, because politics, real politique, is contest or conciliation sometimes, but conflict and cooperation, ultimately between different competing and interested parties, right? The theoretical society attempts to organize itself around disinterested principles and attempts to make it so that the personality of the one who rules, their individuality, is no longer to really be a question anymore, because the ruler himself simply follows the rules, right? So every official within, every functionary acts within the limitations and dictates of his office, and when there's an exception to the rules, he goes to his superior, who makes a determination according to the limitations and dictates of his office, and so on and so forth up the chain until you get to the president, who, has to look at the Constitution as the limitations and dictates of his office. And, you could argue the higher you go in the hierarchy, the more freedom and individuality you have, but also the system's really good at making sure that the people who eventually reach the top have been subjected for a long, long time to an ideology of conformity. So oftentimes the people who would possess the greatest ability to make changes to the system from their individual ideas or actions are often some of the most conformist people. So, in any case, the political and social decisions that are made are often no longer even really decisions. They're outcomes of an equation or a flowchart or something like that. So Horkheimer and Adorno write, quote, "Thought is reified as an autonomous automatic process, aping the machine it has itself produced, so that it can finally be replaced by the machine. Enlightenment pushed aside the classical demand to think thinking. Fichte's philosophy is its radical fulfillment, because it distracted philosophers from the command to control praxis. Mathematical procedure became a kind of ritual of thought. Despite its axiomatic self-limitation, it installed itself as necessary and objective. Mathematics made thought into a thing, a tool, to use its own terms." End quote. So do we see what happened here, right? Enlightenment is supposed to be the movement that elevates thought, but it ends by turning thought itself into a tool, into another one of those objects, formerly disordered nature, right, that can become orderly and understood and named and formalized. And why? The answer is simple. So thought can be used. And I'm reminded of George Boole. If you're familiar with the term Boolean logic, that comes from the work of Boole. He attempted to map human thought. And that is to say that Boole attempted to objectify the process of how humans think, like to write equations which map out the human mind and account for the operations that are going on behind thinking. And Boole's work was foundational as we first began to work to create thinking machines, as they said in those days, which we would now say artificial intelligence. And, Bertrand Russell praised Boole's work, but he felt that he hadn't accurately described how human beings actually think. But I guess the significance of Boole's work was another campaign into an unknown wilderness of Mother Nature, another campaign undertaken in the name of rational domination, right? So in this case, the wilderness that rationalism had to subdue was thought itself. And the thing of interest to me is not so much of whether he was successful or not in actually encapsulating how humans think, but rather that his work did have practical applications. So in some sense, the objective truth didn't matter as much as the utility of the work, and the fact that his entire project of, mapping the human mind and putting it into equations, that's an idea you would only have under this totalizing rationalist framework. Although it is interesting, I guess another kind of contradictory thing is that Boole thought that his insight had come from a direct revelation from God. But I don't know. I guess we don't need to get further into that. So what happens when thought becomes another object? In a way, this development of treating even thought as a calculable quantity that can be used it cancels that subject-object divide that we talked about earlier, right? So the consciousness of the subject is no longer something special, would be one way to put it. The rationality that takes possession over the whole world, even the thought that produced that rationality, is another object that can be taken possession of. So they write, quote, "The equation of mind and world is finally resolved, but only in the sense that both sides cancel out. The reduction of thought to a mathematical apparatus condemns the world to be its own measure. What appears as the triumph of subjectivity, the subjection of all existing things to logical formalism, is bought with the obedient subordination of reason to what is immediately at hand. Knowledge does not consist in mere perception, classification, and calculation, but precisely in the determining negation of whatever is directly at hand. Instead of such negation, mathematical formalism, whose medium, number, is the most abstract form of the immediate, arrests thought at mere immediacy. The actual is validated. Knowledge confines itself to repeating it. Thought makes itself mere tautology. The more completely the machinery of thought subjugates existence, the more blindly it is satisfied with reproducing it. Enlightenment thereby regresses to the mythology it has never been able to escape." End quote. And you could look at a passage like this as referring to people who have maybe a capitalist realist point of view. But, this could be in any type of society. Anyone who just defends the status quo out of incredulity that we could possibly do anything different or have different values in society or run things differently. This is sort of the point of what's happened to thought over the course of Enlightenment. One of the things that corrosive rationality does is relegate everything that's not an immediate certainty to the realm of either, again, irrationality, superstition, or like mere hypothesis or something like that. That there's a certain logic, a certain approach to life, again, that comes out of these Enlightenment ideals, which ultimately leads us to completely abandon the sublative element of thought and just use our reason to justify or rationalize to ourselves why things are the way they are and make apologia for why things are the way they are, which Adorno and Horkheimer would argue is a misuse of knowledge or a misuse of thinking. So in the same way that the cry for equality undoes itself by equalizing man, at the same time it destroys the myths of individuality and human dignity and sovereignty, in the same way subjectivity emerges from that moment of separation of mind from nature as a consequence of objectifying nature in order to dominate it, and that eventually concludes in the objectification of thought in order to dominate thought, which means that thought itself is not really the operative driving force of enlightenment, right? Knowledge, and here specifically meaning knowledge as power, technology, escapes the power of thought in some way, which is a very strange notion. But an easy example would be that most people will accept a series of knowledge claims in the modern day, the claims that are agreed upon by experts or the consensus opinion or something. But we don't as a society necessarily encourage thinking about these claims. Sometimes we actively discourage really thinking about them, right? And these would be the totalizing rationality and its ideals that we hold, sometimes without even being aware of them. And so this is the destruction of subjectivity at the hands of Enlightenment rationality. And that's one of the ways, another self-negation, right? That the Enlightenment in some ways could be seen as like pitched to us on the level of self-preservation, of the ways in which a more rational society would better serve our needs and desires. But it ends up abolishing the self that it intended to preserve on, again, not the level of material reality, but on the level of consciousness. It abolishes the self. Here we're talking about alienation. And there's all these theories about alienation. Horkheimer and Adorno focus on the alienation of the self through the conceptual positivistic world, the worldview that is created. The alienation of the self that happens in consciousness, the self-preservation drive that perceived its own interests in the Enlightenment that ends up enforcing, quote, the self-alienation of individuals who must mold themselves to the technical apparatus, body and soul, Enlightened thinking has an answer for this too. Finally, the transcendental subject of knowledge, as the last reminder of subjectivity, is itself seemingly abolished and replaced by the operations of the automatic mechanisms of order, which therefore run all the more smoothly. Subjectivity has volatilized itself into the logic of supposedly optional rules to gain more absolute control. Reason's old ambition to be purely an instrument of purposes has finally been fulfilled. The exclusivity of logical laws stems from this obdurate adherence to function, and ultimately from the compulsive character of self-preservation. The latter is constantly magnified into a choice between survival and doom, a choice which is reflected even in the principle that, of two contradictory propositions, only one can be true and the other false. End quote. So, the leveling and the disappearance of the individual into the inescapable logic of the system makes the relative abundance meaningless. And it strikes me how similar the critique here is to Carl Jung's critique of modern society. That was more from a psychological angle, in spite of the fact that there are very different political ideas driving these thinkers, right? Carl Jung and Adorno and Horkheimer. But they're all trying to understand how a European civilization, blessed with the fruits of enlightenment, would have repeatedly chosen barbarism. Jung calls it almost a form of mass psychosis, and he was also responding to the two world wars, and then the Soviets had just crushed the rebellions in Hungary and the Czech Republic. So, the socialist dream that was sort of the moment when all the socialists realized that their dream of the sublative movement of history was actually going in the wrong direction. And Jung says, as Adorno and Horkheimer also say, this tendency, this regressive tendency, might even exist more strongly in liberal democratic society, owing to many of the same reasons that Horkheimer and Adorno bring up here. One of the paragraphs in the notes and sketches at the end of Dialectic of Enlightenment reads, quote, "In Germany, fascism triumphed under a crassly xenophobic, anti-cultural, collectivist ideology. Now that it has devastated the earth, nations must fight against it. There is no other way. But when all is over, a spirit of freedom need not spread across Europe. Its nations may become as xenophobic, as hostile to culture, as pseudo-collectivist as the fascism against which they had to defend themselves. Even its defeat will not necessarily break the motion of the avalanche. The fundamental principle of liberal philosophy was that of both and. Today the principle of either or seems to apply, but in such a way that the decision has already been taken for the worse." End quote. And perhaps it's here that I should bring in one of the most significant features of Adorno's thought, which is negative dialectics. We've been talking about dialectics quite a bit throughout this episode, but there was always this sense, again, that the sublation would represent a kind of transcendence. Remember the Marxist account, the dialectic materialist account of sublation and how it works that I gave at the beginning of this episode. What if that sublation doesn't necessarily proceed in a quote-unquote positive direction in terms of actually transcending, actually transcending the regressive kernel and keeping the progressive elements? Because if you'll notice, a lot of the dialectical synthesis, it's not a term from Hegel, but a lot of the results of these dialectical movements that we've discussed have resulted in a negation, but it's more properly called negation, right? Not sublation, if we were to translate it in English, what Adorno and Horkheimer are describing. So rather than the concept or the material circumstance or the culture or the state of consciousness overcoming itself and moving on to a higher level, you could just have a self-negation that all comes to naught, to nothing. And that seems to be the picture that Horkheimer and Adorno give us of what has happened with the Enlightenment. Now, there's a lot of material in the early chapters about Homer's Odyssey that I've skipped over. We're going to talk about that next week. I want to finish out this episode by talking about something that I think will be more explanatory by looking at some of the parts of the chapter on the culture industry, which Horkheimer and Adorno call Enlightenment as Mass Deception. that can show us sort of how this negative dialectic has played out. Because much of what we've discussed so far involves our analysis of just the concept of enlightenment, which can be somewhat abstract, but I think their reflections in the culture industry will help bring these insights into more concrete terms. And just in the very name, the culture industry, I think so much is apparent about the character of Enlightenment consciousness that Horkheimer and Adorno are criticizing. As for what the culture industry is, I mean, I think you can probably just take the term in all its colloquial or cliched meaning, and you'll mostly understand what they're getting at. In the past, I mean, it would have been Hollywood, major record labels, publishing houses, television studios. Today, many of those things still exist. You could also throw in TikTok and Facebook and YouTube and Spotify. Everywhere where mass cultural products are consumed and are produced first and foremost as products rather than primarily as art. Now, before we go further, I mean, again, let's situate ourselves in this time and place. Horkheimer and Adorno saw a striking transformation of how culture was transmitted and experienced during their own lifetimes. I mean, 100 years before, say during the time of Goethe, the only way to absorb a symphony is at the symphony. The only way to see a drama was to go to the theater. But now there's radio, now there's film. And these mediums don't just transmit art, but speech. They transmit ideas and values and judgments and political notions and vibes and all of these things. And, obviously with the internet, it's an even more remarkable transformation. It's taken these things much farther, where we can transmit vibes or memes or cultural products over a much greater distance to far more people. But I think the trends that are identified here were already apparent in many of the early forms of cultural commodification. It's just that they're all the more powerful. They've been sharpened and brought out all the more powerfully today. So what these technologies provide is the ability to refine art and entertainment and ideas into products, into commodities. Again, it's not just like an inevitability. It's the fact that we have the power to do that now on a standardized, mass industrialized scale, just like all other products. And that completely changes the way that art and culture can be engaged with, because there's a real interest by those who, the shareholders who own all these culture industry institutions. That's how they choose to use that power, right? And a lot of this comes also with that whole rationalist mindset. I mean, we can attach a valuation now to what a symphony is worth with more and more precision and more quantized sort of, like a way to think about this would be you have a limited amount of airtime on the radio and you can kind of keep track of how much money you're making according to advertising. And so like the airtime during, say, the Super Bowl, the advertising that you're going to play there is going to be worth like a lot more money because of the amount of eyeballs on it, so on and so forth. You can kind of determine like, I don't know, how much the time spent listening to, a certain piece of music or a certain talk show or whatever, we can attach all these valuations to it, like literal monetary valuations now. We can calculate the value of a film based on, the box office revenue and all of these things. And these cultural productions can be distributed to more people than ever, as we've said, which means you can make more money on them than ever, drives the motivation to achieve even greater distribution, even greater efficiency in churning out cultural products. It's kind of a vicious circle, we might say. And, of course, people could point out culture's always been a product in some form or another. It's just that, again, it's like the Industrial Revolution reaches the arts. Culture becomes an industrial product. It's produced with regularity, with consistency, according to a standard blueprint. And one of the interesting points that Horkheimer and Adorno make is that to some extent, the romantic conservatism that sought to preserve the patronage model of the arts, which is the way the arts used to be supported, in which a wealthy lord or a noble became a patron of the arts, and then this situation safeguarded the arts from having to gain mass appeal or be mass marketable or commodifiable on that scale. And this was to the good of society relative to what's happened now, right? They don't imagine that we could necessarily go back to the patronage model. They're just saying, now all culture is subject to market forces. That arrangement at least preserved art for a time. And that there was at least a good reason for the patronage model, even if it was always destined to wither away in the face of corrosive rationality. And why should it wither away? Well, because why should some noble decide what art gets made? I mean, we ought to open up that decision to the masses, right? Isn't that more democratic? Isn't that liberation of the taste of the masses, right? But how does that work in practice, right? That's why the culture industry is so instructive for revealing the contradictory nature of enlightenment. And leaving aside the actual text for a moment and sort of jumping to the present day, let's use the internet as an example. What was the promise of the internet? If we look, for example, to the words of the tech optimists in the late 80s and early 90s, they dreamed of a world where people from every country could be joined together in cyberspace, where information could travel freely, free exchange of ideas couldn't be hindered or halted by authoritarian governments. Human rights abuses and crimes against humanity could be exposed and shared with the world. And of course, just by exposing and sharing those, that would fix the problem, right? Corruption and exploitation would be brought to light and the public could put a stop to it. And even if you don't believe such lofty goals are realistic, at the very least, you could just look at the whole development of the internet as positive in that it democratized the ability to have a voice, even if everybody in practice doesn't have the same voice, right? At least there's a platform for everyone. Not everyone has an audience, but everyone can say what they want to say. Everyone can express themselves. They can share their views. They could share their art. And so you would think, in theory, the internet should represent the advent of a more free and open society. You would expect a cornucopia of individual expression. Now, I'm not going to say none of that happened, or there isn't an extent to which that is true. It's hard to say that the average person has less of a voice now than, say, they did under, feudalism or even 50 years ago, prior to the internet. It's very hard to say that, for whatever hurdles, whether it's big tech censorship or simply the inability of most people to find an audience, at least the technology allows for more expression to take place. But that statement, I think, doesn't really adequately describe the reality of what's happened to the internet, especially in the most recent decade of its existence, because we see how in the same way that a movie that makes the most at the box office will dictate the types of films that are made, and not even that, like just the tropes and the types of characters and the vibes, these all sort of mimetically spread through society based on what's most marketable. The type of content that gets people to click the most will inevitably shape the kind of content that is made. And you could say, well, that's just market demand, revealing what the public wants, what they desire. But is it? Just to use one example, news stories that make you feel afraid or angry are going to get more people to click. And that incentivizes the platforms to show you more news and stories that make you scared and angry. And more than that, all of you keep clicking more and more vigorously and get more scared and angry. Eventually, the algorithm becomes a reflection of that. But is that because you desired to be scared and angry? Or is it because it's a sort of a cynical manipulation of human nature on an unconscious level almost, right? And there are people who work in marketing who know all the elements that will make a video go viral, and they try to make this happen almost like a science. There's formulaic methods of writing. This happens in films. There's formulaic methods of making action films. So many blockbusters are carbon copies of one another that are written by committees. But that's true of all cultural commodities, and that only accelerates in some ways the more like democratic, quote unquote, you make it. The more you just make it raw popularity, raw market force. And, again, that's not an inevitability. That's a choice, that's the only value we're going to use to determine what kind of cultural commodities are created. And so instead of an explosion of individuality, what happens over time is that what succeeds, what resonates, what dominates, what comes out of that whole process of cultural production ends up being homogenous. Because it's not actually like individual or peculiar tastes that govern anything. It's collective taste. And that sort of has to be the case when culture is just, it's just a result of productive forces of industry. And we see this everywhere. It's almost hard. I'm making all the logical arguments for why this would be that are put forward in the text, but it's almost hard to argue that this isn't just what we see with our eyes empirically. Like, we have this abundance of cultural products now, way more than anyone's ever had at any point in history. how many Star Wars television shows came out in the last year alone. And yet there's a homogeneity of all the cultural products. I mean, I ask again, how many Star Wars television shows came out in the last year alone? They're just milking existing intellectual property forever because they're tried and tested products. They're tried and tested brands. And that's how we experience art today. So Horkheimer and Adorno write, quote, "Culture today is infecting everything with sameness. Film, radio, and magazines form a system. Each branch of culture is unanimous within itself, and all are unanimous together. Even the aesthetic manifestations of political opposites proclaim the same inflexible rhythm," end quote. So this homogeneity, I mean, you find that in pretty much any industry, or arguably. I mean, an industry that tries to market itself to the average consumer, again, another statistical abstraction, you find out what the average consumer needs or what they want, and you give them that, and you don't really need too many variations of it. You know, you probably have some different flavors. Maybe you have a cheap version, an expensive version, a middle-of-the-road version, and that's what's stocked on the shelves in the average, shop, right? That could apply to almost any product, by the way. I mean, we could be talking about a radiator. We could be talking about soda. The point is, for any product, there's a certain limit of variety beyond which it becomes too niche to be marketable. Or else, sometimes those niches are filled as a very expensive sort of boutique market, right? What always dominates in any industry is the brand or the version of the product that most people can pay for and find adequate to what they need. And this is just a natural thing. It almost hardly doesn't even bear explaining, right? You eventually get one brand dominates the market, and that brand, like Kleenex was a brand, and then now that's associated with the product itself because you don't really need that many different versions of it, right? So Horkheimer and Adorno, however, again, this is a critique of the consciousness. So it's not just simply, well, there's nothing we can do. It's a demand of the market, or there's nothing, there's no decision to be made. This is just the technological, the logic of the current technological relations of production, or however you might explain it. But no, they don't buy this. They say, quote, "The basis on which technology is gaining power over society is the power of those whose economic position in society is strongest. Technical rationality is today the rationality of domination. For the present, the technology of the culture industry confines itself to standardization and mass production, and sacrifices what once distinguished the logic of work from that of society. These adverse effects, however, should not be attributed to the internal laws of technology itself, but to its function within the economy today. Any need which might escape the central control is repressed by that of individual consciousness," end quote. So these are the internal mechanisms of censorship that they mentioned at the beginning. Again, it doesn't have to be this way in their view. It's a societal decision to produce culture this way. But that, when that's the way culture is produced, that's what you're going to have. You're going to have a standardized mass culture. So then we have to ask, why would you want a standardized mass culture? Because that's sort of the miasma that we're all drowning in and want to get out of, right? Why would you want to exist in this culture that simply transmits ideas and sentiments and stories that end up violating the very function of thought or of art, right? So in the case of thought, right, the critique of reification, that's thought's real value to Adorno and Horkheimer. Instead, thought becomes another commodity. It becomes another thing to be objectified and used. And to the extent that the individual thinks, he just uses his thought to reify, to do the opposite, to reinforce the standard mass disseminated ideas. And art, instead of active affirmative creation, becomes the work of the assembly line. It doesn't take the consciousness outside of the assembly line. In other words, culture becomes ideology. And this conformist ideology lurks behind all the cultural productions. And that's why Horkheimer and Adorno believe this entire culture industry exists, to produce this conformity, that it's actually, there's an intentionality behind it. And they make a number of arguments that I think are at least a little bit questionable, but we'll go through them. For one, even the worker's leisure time becomes part of his existence as a worker, right? It's a form of work. Or one of the ways they put it is the shadow of work. So the laborer becomes accustomed to this rhythm. You work for 8 hours, you sleep for 8 hours, and the 8 hours that remain, Any time that isn't eaten up by commuting or chores and so on, you spend in entertainment, entertaining yourself. And then you repeat, right? And the cultural intake has that effect. At no point does it help in creating individuality or independence of thought or the liberation promised by the Enlightenment, but instead it traps the individual's subjectivity in a series of cliches and stereotypes. Importantly, it becomes a sort of duty to consume the products of the culture industry, right? Because otherwise, how are you going to converse with your peers about the latest cultural product? How are you going to have an opinion on the new Star Wars show they're making, right? You're not going to understand the references. You'll be an outsider, right? You won't be part of the group. And again, as I've argued, or the argument that they put forward that I've advanced earlier in the episode, those who employ the workers kind of want them to consume the cultural products, just as much as those producing the cultural products want their product to be purchased. Because recreation is necessary for labor just as much as the laborer getting a good night's sleep. But it's no mistake that the products that they want them to consume impose this dominating rationality on the populace. That the system that churns out these products, of course, the products reflect the consciousness, it reflects the ideology of the system. And so the fact that the culture has become homogenous is the point. The effect of the homogenous culture is to intentionally impose that conformity. And the mass culture, one of the interesting points they make about it is that it's not bereft of style, right? It's oftentimes people will point to slop and, all of these things. But, if you look at like the technical mastery behind our modern productions in film or in music, even styles of writing in novels have come a long way, right? There is technical brilliance in making a modern action film. Like the amount of computer animation, the amount of attention to detail and precision that's put into those projects by countless workers, the scale of these projects, it's really quite awe-inspiring. And the production levels on a modern pop song and just how you can sit and literally have the vocalist get multiple takes for every single syllable and just make it absolutely pristine perfect, right? So one of the points I make is that it's not that there's no style, that the attention, the care, the precision, the attention to style, to technical mastery in the modern day outrivals anyone from the past, or the greats of all ages. The problem is the substance, or the lack thereof, the complete lack of substance. Adorno and Horkheimer do make a number of arguments about how the conformity and the homogeneity is sort of like imposed ideologically within the artwork. But on some level, the substance itself, the fact that it's bereft of substance, really points to the fact that the inner content doesn't matter so much. Oftentimes, the culture industry can produce these fantasies of like extreme individuality, rebellion against the mass culture. So often the main character is an underdog or a rebel or something like that. But the argument would be that these fantasies of rebellious individuality often end up taking the form that doesn't really indict the existing system in any meaningful or substantive way, and usually ends up serving that function as being a fantasy. And, it's sort of the fantasy of being recognized. It's often the fantasy of my individuality is going to allow me to be recognized by the system for the worth that I have, which is sort of the myth of enlightenment from the very beginning. And we sort of create a cinematic fantasy, for example, of the maverick or the rebellious young intellect who proves himself or works outside of the system or the rules and, changes things in order to succeed. Whenever there is a criticism of the existing system, it's usually not very substantive. It's normally in the form of other slogans. And because it all takes place in this cultural fantasy realm, very, very rarely do you get a cultural product that actually indicts the system and advocates for some sort of concrete change to it. Usually the displays of individuality, as Horkheimer and Adorno point out, is actually like a type. The character is really just like a stereotype or an archetype. It's usually just sort of a repeated cliched fantasy of finally being recognized for your individuality by the system And, in so many words, I mean, we're getting, up to 2 hours, so I don't want to spend too much more time on this. But I think they do make a compelling point. And, one way to get at this, actually, that just came to me. If you want to see a fictional story that expresses what Horkheimer and Adorno are getting at with the culture industry, I think this is a perfect analogy. Watch the Black Mirror Season 1 episode. I think it's called 3 Million Merits. Or 15 million merits, something million merits, right? That's their currency. It's like a digital currency. It's like sort of like state vouchers or something. It's a very obviously centrally planned society. Anyway, it's about this society where everyone lives in their own little pod. Everyone spends their days constantly absorbing mass culture. They have a monoculture that's very commodified and superficial. And, there's no substance to anything, right? But, and part of the myth of that culture is like, okay, you can go in like these game shows and you can, perhaps if you have a talent or something that's special about you, you can get picked up and be on one of the networks that blasts out content that everyone watches, and you can be a celebrity, and maybe you could be an influencer or something like that. And, everyone gets their choice of several different channels or different games they can play while they're working, different ways to individualize their little avatar, their PFP, they call it their altar, I think. Maybe that's a different episode. I don't remember. But ultimately, that's all the illusion of choice. And none of that actually amounts to individuality. Or rather, it's consumer choice, right? It's choice within the limitations of homogenous, standardized mass production. And everyone's lives are just dominated by this constant slop that they're all subjected to. But it's also clear that this form of entertainment, it's not just like an idle choice by whoever's running the society. It's like specifically designed to reify this conformist culture. And, the tragedy of that story is that the main character is genuinely rebellious. Like somebody he loves basically is ruined by this system and he wants to take revenge on it. He's genuinely hates the system. And, he pulls this stunt where he expresses in his angry hostility against the whole system on the national media, right? But then one of the media figures recognizes that. He says, hey, this is a marketable cultural commodity. And so the main character, in expressing his rage and hostility at this dehumanizing system, in the end, he becomes an edgy, angry media personality. Because the financial incentive is just better. His life is massively improved. He gets a way bigger pod. It's basically like a little apartment of his own. And he's allowed to exist, within the culture industry, within that Black Mirror story, for the precise reason that even his outrage can be tolerated so long as it's fitted into that dominating logic of the system. It allows rage to be expressed in that system. It allows even critiques or hostility towards the system to be expressed by, say, somebody buying an accessory for their altar, their avatar, right? The way that somebody today might put a Ukrainian flag in their username on Twitter or something like that. Any number of other things. And so it's almost like that example does a better job than I can of like how just everything within this like mono-style, homogenous monoculture, even when the substance sometimes appears to be critical or revolutionary, just always has this effect of sort of channeling everybody back into, this conformist absorption of culture as managed as part of the entertainment business. And the effect is to impose a sameness. And the mass deception they mean, part of that is the very notion that's just inevitable development of technological or market forces when there's a pernicious content to this entertainment. Quote, all are free to dance and amuse themselves, just as, since the historical neutralization of religions, they have been free to join any of the countless sects. But freedom to choose an ideology which always reflects economic coercion everywhere proves to be freedom of the same, end quote. And, another quote, actually, one more. How individuality is allowed, but it becomes commodified into what they call pseudo-individuality. Quote, individuals are tolerated only as far as their wholehearted identity with the universal is beyond question. From the standardized improvisation in jazz to the original film personality who must have a lock of hair straying over her eyes so she can be recognized as such, pseudo-individuality reigns, end quote. And Horkheimer was massively critical of jazz. He was a big classical music fan. Sorry, Adorno was. Adorno, there's comments laced throughout this that are very anti-jazz and very, I think it's like a deconstruction of, musical theory and all of that. Again, we won't get into that. It's just sort of an interesting through line that he thinks jazz is part of the modern culture that is, it's part of the problem in so many words. But, we've mentioned this before, but individuals become types. Another way we could say it is that they become brands. It's funny now that there are memes online where people talk about brands or genres of people, right? Like, what's this genre of man called, And, so one of my final observations would be that we all see this homogeneity and we all come to expect this and we'll even comment on it, We know the tropes of the detective show in which the guilty man confesses when he's, presented the evidence that he did it. You can tell when the chorus is about to drop, and the pop song you've never even heard before. And, you know the calm and impartial tone of the politician. You recognize the cliches he invokes when he says, "But let me be clear," Most of us can sing along to the advertising jingles just like the characters in Demolition Man do. So, and many people make apologies for the sameness of culture that they consume. When they say, "Oh, come on, it's just good fun. It's just a popcorn movie. Just turn off your brain. Just let people enjoy things. Just enjoy this mass culture with everyone else," right? We self-consciously say, "I'm not going to critically think about this. I'm going to let this program me in whatever way, with whatever intentions of the people who made this have." And those people they are self-avowedly churning out culture as a product, as an industrial product. So it's very odd that we would think that just passively absorbing their products would, the ideology behind them would be anything other than a reinforcement of that system. And so this is the nature of the mass deception that's invoked in the chapter title. And the stagnation, the cause of that stagnation, and the apparently inevitable march of progress. The stagnation happens in consciousness on the cultural level. It's why we're unable to conceive of, even fantasize about any alternatives to the current economic or political order. The culture industry is such a perfect example in the modern age to reveal the dialectic of enlightenment, to reveal that central contradiction at its heart, because modern culture has been blessed with technology that has, as we've said, gave everyone a voice. It opened possibilities for freedom of expression, so on and so forth. Opened possibilities for realizing the further liberation of mankind. All of these promises of the Enlightenment. And yet within the Enlightenment from the start was the rationality of domination. Knowledge seeks to objectify the world as the first step in dominating it. So the promises of liberation made by that rationality were always contradictory. They were always false in some way. That's the thing driving this dialectic of myth and enlightenment. And Horkheimer and Adorno, I think, summarize this fairly well. This is in one of the notes included at the end of the volume. Quote, "External pressure has forced human beings to overcome their own inertia, to produce material and intellectual works. Thinkers from Democritus to Freud are not wrong in believing this. The resistance of external nature, to which the pressure can finally be traced back, propagates itself in society through the classes, acting on all human beings from childhood onward as the callousness of their fellows. People are gentle when they want something from those who are stronger, and harsh when the weaker want something from them. That has been the key to the nature of the person in society up to now. The conclusion drawn by conservatives, that terror and civilization are inseparable, is well-founded. What could enable human beings to develop the ability to master complex stimuli, if not their own developmental exertions, which have to be spurred on by external resistance? The resistance which drives them is first embodied in the father. Later it grows 1,000 heads, teachers, superiors, customers, competitors, the representatives and social and state powers. Their brutality stimulates individual spontaneity. That this harshness might be moderated in the future, that the bloody punishments by which humanity has been tamed in the course of centuries could be replaced by the establishment of sanatoria, seems no more than a dream. Simulated compulsion is powerless. Culture has evolved under the shadow of the executioner. Genesis, which tells of the expulsion from paradise, and the Soirees de Petersburg are in agreement on this. Work and pleasure take place under the shadow of the executioner. To contradict this is to fly in the face of all science, all logic. One cannot abolish terror and retain civilization. Even to relax the former means the beginning of disintegration. The most diverse conclusions can be drawn from this, from the worship of fascist barbarism to a flight into the circles of hell. There is one other possibility: to scorn logic if it is against humanity." End quote. And so, here in this note, and at the end of Dialectic of Enlightenment, not tied to any particular essay, just sort of their sketchy notes, we almost have a sentiment that it could have come from Pascal or Kierkegaard. But unlike somebody like Pascal, again, one of the Enlightenment's enemies, these are the words coming from its defenders, people who recognize the freedom that it brought, but also recognize terror and civilization are linked. This is the thing. For all of the, again, tarring and feathering of the critical theorists, have you ever heard a left-wing intellectual make that kind of admission about the levers of power and force that govern society with that degree of clarity and starkness? Or do they always try and obfuscate and hide it? That's one of the things I like about Nietzsche, is that he's actually very upfront about this, of what society is based on. It's based on bloody punishments. And Adorno and Horkheimer actually recognize that. So this whole analysis attempts to show that rationality undoes itself through its domineering tendencies. And so ordered society, civilization that operates according to rational rules and limitations, depends on domination, on a state monopoly on violence, for example, in order to function. There will always be these hierarchies and these relations of power, and the most diverse conclusions can be drawn from that insight. Some become anarchists or communists. They decide, well, then we do have to abolish civilization. We have to abolish the state. Some become fascists. They say, well, if violence has to come with the state, we might as well enjoy it, right? The possibility that Horkheimer and Adorno offer is to hold the good of humanity as, well, an irrational myth. You could put this, they don't really use this language, but perhaps we need to establish a new myth, not on a rational basis, but purely as a demand for a set of values that centers human well-being or flourishing rather than capital efficiency. It's really that simple. We make a new value determination. But to do this, you'd have to be able to envision something outside of that rationality of domination, which seems almost impossible in the modern day. Certainly the whole culture industry is geared towards you not being able to imagine anything outside of that. Perhaps by revealing the way in which consciousness was promised liberation by rationality, but instead found itself conditioned and subjugated by it, maybe we have a chance of reversing that conditioning. And it might begin with a refusal on the individual level. Refusal to be part of the mass culture. I'm going to subject myself to this as little as possible. I'm going to refuse to be the same. I'm not going to absorb the sameness, at least not uncritically absorb it. I'm going to regard it critically, everything that comes from the mass culture, right? And perhaps by giving oneself space from the conformist ideology beneath all mass culture, by setting oneself apart for it, maybe thought could start to regain its true function, which is attacking idols instead of propping them up. Maybe. But that remains to be seen, doesn't it? All right, that's all for this episode, everyone. Join me next week for a further exploration of this book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, where we will talk about Homer's Odyssey. We're going to talk about de Sade, Kant, and Nietzsche, all from the perspective of Horkheimer and Adorno. I hope you'll join me then. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.